In Shakhty, Russia, Andrei Chikatilo seemed to be a devoted family man. His inner life, however, was filled with dark and murderous desires. In 1978, he began to turn these feelings into action. First, he acquired a small shack in a rundown neighborhood. In December, he took a 9-year-old girl there. Her name was Yelena Zakatnova. Her friends called her Lena. He'd met her at a bus stop and offered her something Soviet children rarely enjoyed, bubble gum. She agreed to follow him to the house.
He encountered this girl and first discovered with her that violence on the body of a girl was something that would get him excited.
As he began to molest her, he grew increasingly excited and wanted more direct sexual contact with her.
He was unable to perform sexually, so he used a knife instead.
It was the moment when he discovered that murder was his passion. After that, he knew himself in a new way.
Afterward, he carried Lena to the nearby Grushevka River. He set her body in the water, then tossed her school bag after her. She was found 2 days later. Although policemen investigating the case came across some bloodstains near Andrei Chikatilo's secret house, he was not considered the prime suspect.
The problem is, from the point of view of the police, that he had no criminal record. He was a party member. He had a wife. He had children. He did not fall into any of the categories that they were used to looking for criminals in.
Rather than focusing on Chikatilo, police found someone they deemed a more appropriate suspect, a local man who had spent time in prison for rape. He was later convicted and executed. Having killed for pleasure, Andrei Chikatilo was now able to erase the sense of impotence he'd felt all his life.
He had gained a piece of self-knowledge that he could never shake, which was that what turned him on was powerlessness and ultimately the murder of another person.
Still, coming so close to being caught had frightened Chikatilo. For the next 2 years, he went to work, spent time with his wife and children, read the papers, and waited. He quit teaching to become a supply supervisor, or tolkach, a position unique to the dysfunctional Soviet economic system, where contracts for raw materials often went unfulfilled.
The job of a tolkach was to go around to the various enterprises and try to get them to send the cement or send the rubber or send the steel or whatever it was that was necessary. It was normal for him to go on the road for several days to visit the supplying enterprises for his own enterprises and be gone without any supervision.
It was not a particularly prestigious job for a man of Chikatilo's education. He traveled by train to various factories, trying to maintain the image of a dutiful Soviet citizen.
He does have a struggle. I don't think he just gives himself over to, I am evil personified. I think he says, what I'm thinking, what I'm wanting to do is not healthy, it's not good.
In the case of someone like Chikatilo, the brilliance and the strength of the person was in this iron discipline of keeping the two halves of his personality utterly separate.
For over 2 years, Chikatilo managed to keep his murderous rage under control. But finally, the dark side of his personality resurfaced. On September 3rd, 1981, while passing a library in Rostov-on-Don, Chikatilo spotted 17-year-old Larissa Chichenko. She agreed to take a walk with him along the Don River. Instead, he steered her into the woods. Again, Chikatilo was unable to perform sexually, but he remembered what had satisfied him 2 years earlier in the secret house on Mezhevoy Lane.
He would attempt to have sex, normal sex with the woman. He would inevitably fail. That would release the great rage that lived and lurked inside of Chikatilo.
Sex was the vehicle But the basic need was to feel a sense of power over his victims.
Chikatilo killed with even more brutality than before. He stabbed his victim repeatedly, then savagely bit her.
He was really getting even. He was angry with humanity, but especially with women. He was seeking revenge, and he was getting revenge against the people who rejected him the most.
With this second murder, the veneer of Chikatilo's normal life shattered. A pathology spawned by years of frustration took over. Chikatilo became a serial killer.
He was a man who was impotent. What does the word impotent mean? It means literally without power. So in every case, whether he was dealing with the young boys, the young girls, or the young women, it was essential for Chikatilo to establish physical dominance and control over the victim.
Gratification has been mixed up with anger and hostility, and one complements the other to the degree that you can't even separate them. He became intensely excited and even would spontaneously ejaculate during that mutilation that had taken place.
Then he cut off pieces of his victims' bodies.
Chikatilo admitted making the incisions, admitted removing the uterus, but would never quite cop to the fact that he ate the uterus. He said, "I liked to nibble on it. They were so pink and springy." Those were the words he used.
What had started as a quest for sexual satisfaction had now become a murder spree, the worst in Russian history. (1984), Rostov-on-Don, Russia. Andrei Chikatilo had now murdered 23 people. Faced with these brutal killings, police began to question anyone who looked suspicious. On September 13th, two Rostov detectives spotted a 6-foot-tall man wearing a black fur cap.
He was trying to make conversation with a young girl. It was decided not to detain him on the spot, but follow up and see what he was going to do.
The officers tailed the suspect as he approached one young woman after another. Eventually, they observed him fondling a prostitute in a deserted station. This act of public lewdness was enough for detectives to arrest the man. He identified himself as Andrei Chikatilo. He was carrying a small leather case.
He had a briefcase, and in the briefcase was Vaseline, ropes, and knives. Well, that sounds to me like what we refer to as a kill kit.
But after questioning Chikatilo, investigators discovered that he was a devoted family man and a loyal Communist Party member. He was eventually released.
They were looking for a young killer who had a criminal record, who might have been known as a sexual pervert in his community.
He had gray hair, thick glasses. He was tall and skinny with a little pouch of a belly. He seemed to be just another face in the crowd of people that you would see in a provincial Soviet city.
In addition, police laboratories mishandled a blood test that could have tied Chikatilo to the crimes.
Well, the Russian police were, first of all, technologically in the Stone Age, and in terms of organization were on that level as well. So typically blood and sperm samples would get lost.
That in itself was an example of the failures of Soviet science and of Soviet production capabilities.
Chikatilo was free to kill again. Police were desperate to stop the attacks, so they decided to try an American criminological technique, psychological profiling. Psychiatrist Alexander Bukhanovsky was recruited to create a psychological portrait of the killer.
Preparing the criminal's profile took several months of hard work. I had access to top secret materials that have never been published.
By analyzing this evidence, Bukhanovsky painted an intriguing description of the killer.
Bukhanovsky said that the criminal was unsociable, that he was very ill. He stressed sexual perversions. He said the criminal could either be living on his own or with a wife, but he didn't have a sexual relationship with her.
Yet it would take police another 6 years to capture Chikatilo.
A lot of the factors that caused the demise of the Soviet Union were also at work in the Chikatilo case and enabled him to kill as long as he did and as many people as he did without being caught.
Finally, on November 20th, 1990, after a 12-year killing spree and 52 victims, Andrei Chikatilo was arrested. Dr. Bukhanovsky's profile would prove chillingly accurate.
In his confessions, he says he enjoyed their cries, he enjoyed the blood, and he enjoyed their pain. Well, he's obviously a sexual sadist.
What the serial murderer learns with the act of his first murder is that he can be in control. Because until this time, they've basically been the scattered pieces of an individual that has never made them feel that they are in charge.
The most serious motivating force for a lot of people, if not all people, is sex. The desire to procreate, the desire to be a sexual being. And in his case, it was just a totally frustrated, humiliating failure that he struggled with all of his life.
Spring 1992. Andrei Chikatilo, 56-year-old grandfather and loyal party member, stood accused of a string of gruesome and brutal murders. The Soviet Union had collapsed, becoming the Commonwealth of Independent States. Chikatilo's trial promised to be the first great spectacle of the post-Soviet era. The Russian people reacted with grim fascination.
Once Chikatilo's case became more or less public knowledge, the local people were hideously aware that a serial killer was in their midst, and nothing spreads faster in Russia than rumor.
And soon, Chikatilo would be given a nickname befitting his murderous deeds: the Butcher of Rostov. On the morning of April 14th, 1992, in the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don, citizens flooded the steps of the House of Justice, anxious for a glimpse of the accused killer, Andrei Chikatilo. For months, newspaper headlines had branded him the Red Ripper, or the Butcher of Rostov. Chikatilo was dressed in a souvenir Olympic sports shirt provided by the court. His head had been shaved, a standard procedure to guard against lice. As proceedings began, the setting resembled a circus more than a murder trial.
He was in a large iron cage in the courtroom. The cage was to protect him from the rage of the parents of the victims.
He was never able to sit at a table and converse with his lawyer the way a Western defendant would have been. It was a bizarre scene. In the public seating, you had a number of family members of victims who were quite vehement in their desire to see him executed. And if they had had the option of seeing him executed by having wolves tear him apart, they would have voted for that.
The victim's parents' reaction was understandably strong. When he was put in his cage, people rushed towards it and shouted, "Give him to us." But how else would you expect the parents who lost their children to behave?
On the opposite end of the courtroom, Justice Leonid Akupjanov presided, flanked by ordinary citizens, the Russian equivalent of the Western jury. The judge read the list of charges. The volume of evidence filled 222 casebooks. The story they told was grim and horrifying in its details. The victims' ages varied from 9 years old to 45. They were both male and female.
The ultimate point of the sexual act is to create life. Chikatilo's idea of it was that it should climax in death, so he was Mr. Anti-Sex, Mr. Anti-Life.
It took 2 days for the judge to read through his list of indictments. On April 16th, the defendant was allowed an opportunity to address the court. Families of Chikatilo's victims screamed insults. Some fainted. In a rambling 2-hour statement, Chikatilo described himself as a man robbed of his genitals. Born impotent, Chikatilo claimed to be cursed by a lifetime of sexual frustration that had eventually driven him to murder. He asserted that he had never planned to kill, but that he had been seized with shaking and shivering and had lost control.
He seemed at various times intent on proving that he was crazy. At some points that I witnessed, he jumped up and started shouting at the judge and then dropped his pants and exposed himself. At other times, he started cursing and screaming and so forth.
Most observers believed Chikatilo's behavior in the courtroom was an act, an effort to gain sympathy. If found criminally insane, Chikatilo could be placed in a psychiatric hospital. If judged sane, however, he faced execution. In Russia, that meant a single bullet to the back of the head.
The definition of sanity and insanity from the legal point of view, which is an international definition and was used in the Soviet Union, was, can the person in question tell the difference between right and wrong?
The trial would continue for 6 months. Throughout, Chikatilo presented himself as a wretched victim of nature's indifference and a gruesome metaphor for Russia's 70-year failed social experiment.
When he was defending himself, he blamed Stalin, he blamed his parents, he blamed the cannibalism of the famine, he blamed the Communist Party, and he even blamed his own blood type.
Prosecutors would argue that Andrei Chikatilo was in fact the most calculating, diabolical killer of all time.
His crimes were sickening, but I don't think he was sick in the psychiatric or legal sense. Certainly not insane. He was more bad than he was mad, and he was certainly very crafty, but he wasn't crazy.
October 14th, 1992 would signify the day of reckoning for serial murderer Andrei Chikatilo. It had taken nearly 2 months for Judge Leonid Akobzhanov to write his final verdict.
Everybody knew he was going to be convicted. Everybody knew what the sentence was going to be. But there was, I guess, some value in going through the ritual.
Учитывая чудовищные злодеяния, что он творил, судебная коллегия не может не назначить ему единственное наказание, которое он заслуживает, исключительную меру наказания, и приговаривает его к смертной казни.
After a 12-year murder spree, final justice came swiftly. On February 15th, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was escorted through the halls of Rostov prison and led to a private cell. There he was executed by a single shot behind the right ear. In the aftermath of his execution, writers, reporters, and victims' families attempted to find some trace of humanity in Andrei Chikatilo. But in many ways, this man, who committed extraordinarily cruel crimes, remains an enigma.
He spoke himself of some of his motivations, and yet when you hear any single explanation, it never rings with sufficient truth to explain the hideous crimes that this man committed.
Having seen the dead bodies of so many victims, it may have seemed natural for me to hate him. And that is what I felt until Chikatilo was finally captured. At that point, I realized that Chikatilo wasn't in control of what he was doing. He was a very sick person, acting against his will.
Whether you believe that he was the victim of the circumstances under which he was born, or whether you believe he was an evil person who used free will to do what he did and wanted to kill, that evil that grew in him is not something that's alien to all of us.
Perhaps the final judgment on the life of Andrei Chikatilo was written by the killer himself, an expression of guilt and self-loathing that at the same time hints at his gruesome, violent nature. And now my brain should be taken apart, piece by piece, and examined, so there wouldn't be any others like me.